6:30, and it is good to see you guys tonight. And if you are watching with us online this evening, we are glad to have you with us. And some of us have gotten some rain today or this evening. Some places it's dry. But it is good to have you with us and good to get started this evening. We are going tonight to be in Judges chapter 15 as we continue our look in particular, not just through the entire book of Judges, but we are, of course, right now looking at the life of Samson in particular. And we have all kinds of images that perhaps come to mind when we think about Samson. And Samson is one of those characters we probably talk a little bit more about in children's Sunday school. We know the story about Samson and his great strength, but when you get into the story of Samson, there's a lot of details they left out in children's Sunday school class. And probably for good reason. Not perhaps the most, Samson has some parts of the story that aren't the most child favorable, but we're going to begin in that. So let's start tonight with a word of prayer, and then we'll look at Judges 15. Heavenly Father, we are grateful tonight that you've given us a place to come and to look into your word, to study, to learn from the things that you have told us that reveal to us who you are, what you've done, how to recognize your activity and give us hope. Well, I pray that tonight as we look at this story, that we would do all those things from it. We would learn, but we would also take hope from your work. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So last week, in case you missed it, we were in Judges chapter 14. And in Judges chapter 14, we saw Samson's first marriage, or at least the circumstances around that. And so, if you remember from last week, or if you were here, he saw, it says, a Philistine woman in a city called Timnah. And Samson said to his mother and father in chapter 14 that he wanted to marry her. They somewhat objected to his choice of women, and his response was, "Get her, she looks good to me." And that, of course, could be taken on a couple of different levels, but it really does tie into really ultimately what is the theme, or one of the themes of the book of Judges we see at the very end of the book, and that is everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And really what Samson is saying here is that in my eyes, she's right. So he may be referring to how she looks. I'm sure he probably is. But he's also saying, by my standards, she's the right one. He's doing exactly what the book of Judges has been talking about. He's ignoring God's covenant. He's ignoring God's commands. He's ignoring the expectations that God has, and says, I don't care about God's standards. I just want to do what I want to do. And that's our hero here, so to speak, in this story. So the wedding gets put together. There's a 7-day feast in the Philistine tradition leading into the actual wedding. Events take place that, without getting into the details, that cause Samson and the men of the village there to get upset with each other. Samson loses a bet, and the price is he's supposed to provide 30 sets of full clothes for the men of that town. So because he feels they kind of cheated on the bet he made, he goes to the neighboring community, kills 30 men, takes their clothes, and says, "Here you go." They were used clothes. We'll just say that. That's kind of how we wrapped up the chapter 14. So to come to chapter 15, I want us to look at the very last verse of chapter 14, then we'll begin reading in chapter 15. So 14, verse 20. Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his friend. Now, we could just stop right there. The last verse of chapter 14, we realize, oh, this sounds bad. And, of course, what had happened is Samson had left in such anger, and, of course, when you kill 30 guys, and, it kind of puts a damper on the festivities. And he leaves, obviously, in anger. And so the father of the bride assumed Samson was done. He was angry. He wasn't coming back. And so he gave his daughter to be married to essentially what was Samson's best man. And that's where we ended chapter 14. If this sounds ominous, it's because it is. Verse 1, chapter 15. After a while, in the time of wheat harvest, Samson visited his wife with a young goat and said, I will go into my wife in her room, but her father did not let him enter. Her father said, I really thought that you hated her intensely, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please let her be yours instead. Samson then said to them, This time I shall be blameless in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches and turned the foxes tail to tail and put one torch in the middle between the two tails. When he had set fire to the torches, he released the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines, thus burning up both the shocks and the standing grain, along with the vineyards and the groves. The Philistines said, Who did this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he took his wife and gave her to his companion. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. Now we're just going to pause there. There's more to come. This is usually part of the Samson story we tell the kids on Sunday morning in Sunday school, perhaps. But so Samson comes back. We don't really know how long it was between said wedding feast and slaughter and when Samson comes back. But it also was not entirely unusual for marriages of this type for the husband and sister to spend most of his time gone and just show up every once in a while at home. That's kind of the idea. And we have every indication here that even the Philistines kind of seem somewhat surprised, or they're assuming that Samson and the lady or the girl are still married. And they clearly see the father-in-law here as being in the wrong. But so Samson's been gone for some unspecified period of time, and he comes back during the time of the wheat harvest. By the way, this would be roughly May, from what we know that part of history when the wheat harvest would have been there. So we're talking about May. So Samson shows back up. Now, nowadays, when the husband wants to show up at his wife's doorstep and make nice and try to cover up, try to smooth over some misunderstanding, what do we bring nowadays, guys? Roses, candy, flowers of some sort, maybe something like that. Ice cream, okay. Diamonds, yeah, diamonds work too, yeah. Ladies, what would you prefer? Flowers, diamonds, all of the above. Okay, so flowers with a diamond in the with a side of ice cream. All right. So, well, Mr. Romance here brings a goat, a live goat. Well, nothing says I love you like a goat. All right, so Brent, you just keep that in mind. Hey, you just tie the goat up at different places in your yard. You really never have to mow. Just move it around every couple days, and don't ever have to mow again. So Samson brings a goat, Mr. Romantic, and Dad says, "No, you can't go in. She's really not your wife anymore. I really thought you were never coming back." And you can understand where Dad's coming from. It's not unreasonable for him to think that Samson's never going to come back. But he still made a mistake here. And Samson is irritated that he no longer has the girl he wants to marry. And so Dad-in-law makes a bargain compromise. Well, here, I have another daughter, and she's really prettier than the one you were going to marry. So why don't you just take her instead? Who says romance is dead? Samson is not pleased with the idea, and so we see what he does here. He goes. It says 300 foxes. It's actually kind of an interesting word. It's probably actually a jackal, not a fox. In Hebrew, it's the exact same word for fox or jackal. Foxes are a little harder to come by. They're a little more isolated animals. Jackals will sometimes run in packs. It's probably jackals, if it makes a difference to you, if it's foxes or jackals. And he finds 300 of them, ties their tails together, as well as figuring out a way to attach a torch to those tied together tails, lights the torches, and lets them go. And as you can imagine, they It's a very chaotic scene. And essentially, the long and short of it is all their wheat crop, as well as the olive groves, they're all burnt up. He essentially removes their ability to eat anytime. So he takes away their ability to take care of themselves. And they figure out what's happened. They figure out who's responsible. It's Samson. And so you're the Philistines, and you go, okay, we have two choices here. We can deal with Samson, or we can deal with the father-in-law. Well, Samson's already killed a few of them, and they know his reputation, so they choose the easier target, and they go after the father-in-law and the daughter. And if you remember chapter 14, Samson had given a riddle that this young lady, his bride-to-be, was able to get out of him, and she takes that secret and tells them, because they threatened to burn her house down if she didn't get the secret out of Samson. Now, what's the irony here, of course, is she does exactly what they want her to do to keep from being burned, and she gets burned anyway. Now, we'll see this a couple different times. In fact, we're going to see this kind of as a running theme throughout the story of Philistines and Samson, is that every time the Philistines make a plan or a plot, have some device to deal with Samson, it always backfires. And the first time here is, in fact, the daughter here, Samson's bride-to-be. She had acted, probably not, I'm sure she didn't really want to do what she had to do in getting the secret out of Samson and kind of betraying him, but she did that under threat of her life. She did it, in her mind, she is protecting her family and her home to do this. So, but what happens when she works to save herself, she actually ends up ultimately sealing her own doom anyway. Now, there's a lesson in that for us we're going to get to a little bit later on here, but so this is what took place, and the Philistines burn her and her house down, and probably as far as they're concerned, the matter is over with. Samson's left. He's destroyed the crops. They've burned down the house and killed these two people. And probably they also think, well, Samson was mad at them. That's why he did all this. So we can probably do this, and there's not going to be consequences. In fact, we probably are going to appease Samson in the process. Now, it doesn't quite work out that way. So verse 6, they've burned his wife and the father-in-law. Verse 7, Samson does this. Samson said to them, "Since you act like this, I will surely take revenge on you. But after that, I'll quit." He struck them ruthlessly, or you may have the word viciously, with a great slaughter, and he went down and lived in the cleft of the rock of Edom. Now, a couple things here, and we're going to see this repeatedly. The Philistines, over and over and over again, misunderstand, miscalculate Samson and his response and everything. I would imagine in their own minds they're probably doing Samson a favor. They think, hey, he's mad at them, we'll kill them, he'll be okay with that. But where's the fault in that logic? The Philistines are thinking to themselves, perhaps, if we burn down the house and kill the father-in-law and the wife who did this to him, he'll be okay with that. Where's the fault in that logic, besides the obvious killing somebody? Okay. Now he clearly is still in love with her because he was mad enough, because he's mad because he can't have her back. He brought her a goat. What? I mean, enough said. And two, if Samson had wanted them dead, was Samson more than able to do that on his own? And from what little we've seen of Samson already, even though we don't know the whole story yet, if we're just reading this for the first time, from what we've already seen of Samson, is he beyond the idea of killing somebody who he's mad at? In fact, sometimes he didn't have to be mad. Sometimes he can just do it. So I think there's a couple things here. That the Philistines seem to be working on the idea, well, that Samson won't be upset if we kill his wife. But Samson clearly still did have feelings for her. Whatever fault Samson had, he still loved her. And then two, if he'd wanted her dead, if he wanted the father-in-law dead, I'm sure Samson could have arranged that. So if they had just stopped to think for a few moments about what they were getting ready to do, they might have realized it doesn't seem to be as good of an idea as maybe we thought. Well, that happens sometimes. I got a hunch the Philistines here are making decisions not based upon some logical, reasoned out course of action. Why are they doing what they're doing? Why are the Philistines doing all this? Revenge. They're mad. And granted, he burned up all their food. Would probably make us mad too. But this whole thing started, on something much smaller, and it's just escalating. What's happening is this, and Samson's no angel here. We're not saying Samson's necessarily in the right all the way through this. But what you have here in Samson and the Philistines, you have two sides here that just keep getting angry with one another, and each response is just escalating what's happening. And neither one of them are probably acting overly rational all the time. There's just this growing conflict. Now, it's very easy for us, and we'd be right to say that their responses, whether it's Samson's responses or the Philistines' responses, this is not really the best way to do all this. But there's also something else that we looked at last week. Let me just remind you about all this. Remember when Samson told his parents he wanted to marry this Philistine girl, and they got upset. How could you want to marry one of them? Why don't you marry one of your own people? And they were upset. And in verse 4 of chapter 14, it said this: Samson's father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, for God was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. In other words, Samson was wrong. Samson was acting wrong. He was sinful in what he was doing. But the Lord had a plan, and God's plan was to sow trouble, to start a fight. In a sense, God's picking a fight with the Philistines so that he will get Israel delivered. Because Israel's at a point, and we're going to see this again here in just a few moments, Israel's at a point where they have accepted their sin, they have accepted the oppression, they have accepted the occupation of the Philistines. Israel doesn't even want to be delivered anymore. They don't even want to be rescued. And so before God will rescue them and deliver them, he has to kind of rile up his own people a little bit so they will actually stand up and get to work. So this irrational, emotional back and forth between the Philistines and Samson is actually, while it's all sinful, and you would say this is not how you want to behave, God's actually got a plan here that he's working behind the scenes to start this conflict. Yeah, so if you hear that in line, the analogy is to the Exodus, when the people of Israel are crying, are in slavery, and even in these first few plagues, when Pharaoh refuses to let them go, the tension's escalating, and of course it is. There are times that Pharaoh says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, but actually most of the time in Exodus it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. In fact, before Moses ever shows up, God tells Moses in the wilderness, "I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will say no, so that I can in turn demonstrate my glory." So these are all things that God's orchestrating. So even though Samson and the Philistines are both acting in ways that we would say, don't do that, God's still going to take all these things to accomplish his purposes. So these men burn and kill Samson's father-in-law and wife. And Samson says, okay, if you're going to do that, I'm coming after you. You do it to me, I'm going to do it to you. Now, he seems to be under the pressure that after that he's done. He said, after that I'll quit. So let me ask you this. We know that Samson ultimately is supposed to be a deliverer for the people of Israel. Is Samson at this point actually interested in finding the Philistines to be a deliverer? Is he actually worried about rescuing Israel from the oppression What's Samson interested in? Getting even. Yeah, he's himself. He's interested in getting even. So he says there in verse 7, I'm going to come after you. I'm going to get even. And after that, I'm done with this. I'm done with you guys. Verse 8, he struck them ruthlessly with a great slaughter. You may have the words viciously. This is one of those little times that the English has a hard time translating. It's a Hebrew idiom. It literally means he went after them. He slaughtered them leg over thigh. It's an idiom that says thigh or a leg over thigh or leg to thigh. We don't really know what that means. Some guys speculate it's a reference to maybe like a wrestling move. This is my own 2 cents here. All right. The first thing I thought of when I thought of leg to thigh in a vicious move was almost like a martial arts type of an idea, where you had the big strong guy, and he's kicking or diving into the leg. And what happens when a big old strong guy kicks everything he has right into there? Leg to thigh. What does it do? It crushes the bone. It blows the knee out. It crushes the bone. It's a brutal move. To crush the thigh bone, to crush the femur, takes an incredible amount of force. And it's almost a picture here that Samson is so brutal that he's going to slaughter these guys, and not just, he's not going to kill them nicely. He's going to make them suffer. He's maiming them. He's doing to these men what he did to the lion with his hands. He's not using a gun. He's not using a sword. He's not using a knife. He's with his bare hands essentially just crushing these guys to the pulp. He's literally just tearing them apart. He's brutal. It says ruthless or vicious. There's our hero again. Now, again, this is impressive perhaps from an action movie point of view, but in real life, this is brutal. This is incredible brutality here that's going on. So this is Samson. And then he decides he's done. He kills these guys from this village because he's sick of them, and he goes hiding into the area called Edom, an area outside of the area called Lehi. Now, this is going to be in the area of the tribe of Judah. He's hiding in the wilderness on the western sides of the tribe of Judah. So he takes off. Now, what do you think the Philistines are going to do? Do you think they're content, like Samson is, to just let it all lie? No. Yeah. The Philistines don't let this lie. He's killed quite a few of them now, and they cannot let this Israelite thug get the best of them. So they send an army. So verse 9, the Philistines went up and camped in Judah and spread out in Lehi. And by the way, the camp is spread out here. These are actually military terms. They brought an army. The men of Judah, so this is the people of Israel, the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" And they said, "We've come up to bind Samson in order to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us?" He said to them, "They did to me, I've done to them." In other words, Samson goes, "I didn't start it." So, but catch it. Here's what's happening. Remember, this is our proof that the Israelites have just gotten comfortable even in their oppression. If we were to go back to the very first chapter of Judges, we would find that Judah were known as pretty good warriors. They were fighters. In fact, they were led by some of the descendants of Caleb and Joshua fame. Back in they were led, and they spread out and they captured all this territory in the southern part of Israel. And so in chapter 1, Judah are these fighters. They're good. And in chapter 15, where's Judah? man, Samson, dude, you're causing us so much trouble. Don't you know they're in charge? You're rocking the boat, dude. Stop it. You're going to get us killed. Sit down, shut up. And in fact, what they actually end up doing is taking their own military. Judah takes their own soldiers, and instead of confronting the Philistines, instead of saying, no, Samson is our anointed deliverer, we're going to rise up with him and cast you off, they said, we'll turn our own guy in. When confronted with the enemy of God's people turn on their own deliverer instead of fighting the enemy. It does happen more than once, yes. Yeah. We do see, and we've talked about this before, not every portion of every story, but you do see, God reveals to us in the habits and the stories of the Old Testament the patterns that we need to recognize for what takes place later on. So yes, the people of Israel say to Samson, what are you doing? These guys are going to come and wipe us out. They're the one, you are picking a fight that we can't win. And so they go after Samson. They said to him, verse 12, we have come down to bind you so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. Samson, we've come, you're our countryman, you're our fellow Israelite. Now, they're not the same, Samson's from the tribe of Dan, these are from the tribe of Judah, and we realize that the tribes of Israel were not always getting along real well, but still, they are turning over their Israelite brother to the Philistines. And Samson, who's probably more than able to defend himself, I think he's proven that, hadn't he? Puts up no fight. He says only this, swear to me that you will not kill me. They said to him, no, but we will bind you fast and give you into their hands, yet surely we will not kill you. They bound him with two new ropes and brought him up from the rock. Now, what are the Philistines intending to do to Samson? They want to kill him. They've already said, we're going to do to you what you did to us. Of course, he said, I'm doing to you what you did to me first. And so, do the tribe of Judah soldiers, do they know what the Philistines are going to intend to do with Samson? Yeah, of course they do. Oh, we're not going to kill you. We're just going to give you to the guys who will kill you. But we didn't do it. Now, again, does this sound familiar? Is there another of God's deliverers who at some point the people of Israel will turn over to somebody else so they will kill him instead? Yeah. This is a clear allusion to Christ. It's pretty obvious. And Samson doesn't fight him. Again, Samson's no virtuous guy for us to imitate perhaps most of the time. But again, we are seeing glimpses and pictures of things that will foreshadow Christ. Samson says, yeah, I won't fight you guys. So, he is taken to the Philistines. When he came to Lehi, this is verse 14, the Philistines shouted as they met him. I'm sure that was a shout of joy. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so that the ropes that were on his arms were as flax that's burned with fire. His bonds dropped from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, so he reached out and took it and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I've killed 1,000 men. And when he had finished speaking, he threw the jawbone from his hand, and he named that place Ramath Lehi. Now let's look at this for a couple seconds here. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. These ropes they put on him. So basically, just imagine a completely burned up rope, all such as just paper almost. It just tears easily. That's what these ropes become to him. He finds laying there, not that he really needs it perhaps, but he finds the jawbone of a donkey. Now, verse 15 says he found what kind of a jawbone? Fresh. What does that fresh jawbone mean? This is not some dried out skeletal piece of bone that's been on the ground and sun bleached for a couple of years. This has still got the skin on it. It's probably got some blood on it. The teeth are probably still attached. We were speculating this afternoon. How fresh was this donkey bone? Did he take it off a live donkey? I don't know. It's a fresh donkey jawbone. Either way, and I think part of that would be, if a bone had been sitting out there kind of bleached in the sun for a couple of years, it probably is getting kind of fragile itself as a jawbone. This thing is fresh, it's strong, and it's going to hold up to what he's getting ready to use it for. He takes this jawbone and he kills 1,000 men. This obviously is the work of God through Samson, a remarkable thing. And it's not unusual for the men of God, once God has done some miraculous thing through them, to sing or to celebrate in some way. We talked about Moses and Exodus. When they come through the Red Sea, they sing this great song about how God threw the horse and rider into the sea. Well, Samson's not above this. Now, but does Samson give a lot of credit to God here? What's Samson say? Look at what I did. Now, on top of that, once we get into the heap, this is actually Samson's a punster, so I like this. This is good. Samson gives a little pun here. It turns out that in Hebrew, the word for donkey and the word for heaps are almost exactly the same. They're spelled exactly the same. The vowel sounds are slightly different, but they're almost the exact same word. So he's making a pun here between the donkey and the mounds that he's building here. And understand he's not referring to a mountain he's fighting on top of. He's referring to the mountain of corpses that he has piled up. I mean, and you can imagine 1,000 bodies is going to make a little bit of a hill here. That's what he's referring to. It's actually somewhat of it's a mean-spirited pun where he's talking about the bodies he's piling up with this donkey jawbone. So Samson's doing a little trash talking. I would imagine there were more Philistines than 1,000 there. It never really tells us exactly how many came to begin with. Enough that the Judahites massed up an army of 3,000 and were still afraid. But at some point, I guess, after 1,000 of you guys have been killed by Samson, they decide enough is enough, and let's leave while they're getting good. And it says that he named the place Ramath Lehi, which means, and we'd be appropriate by calling it's Jawbone Hill. He names the place Jawbone Hill. And again, while there probably are some hills, he's really not talking about geography here. He's talking about the hill of dead corpses that he has left there. When Moses named places, he would name them after things like Ebenezer. He would talk about the place remembering of what God had done, or they would mark a place of what God had done, and they would build an altar there. And for Samson, his altar is the pile of dead bodies. So he finishes the job here. And then one more thing here, verse 18. After this, he became thirsty. Okay, hard work killing 1,000 guys with a donkey jawbone. That's not easy to say, by the way. He became very thirsty, and he called to the Lord. This is the first time God's been mentioned here in a while, isn't it? Really. He called to the Lord and said, "You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant." And now he's recognizing God. "And now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" But God split the hollow place that's in Lehi, so the water came out of it. When he drank, his strength returned and he revived. Therefore he named it in Hakor, which is in Lehi to this day. He judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Now, does this story sound familiar? Am I out here did you deliver me just so I can die? And then water comes out of a rock. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. People of Israel, delivered from Egypt, in the wilderness. God, did you save us just to bring us out here to die? We're dying of thirst here. Moses hits the rock, water comes out, everyone's happy. Well, except God. So, wow, that's kind of interesting. So on the one hand, Samson can be for us a bit of a Christ-like figure in foreshadowing the behavior and the circumstances around what will happen with Jesus. On the other hand, he is really throughout a lot of his story, a symbol of also Israel. He exhibits personally every trait that the nation of Israel does in its relationship towards God. God provides something, and it never seems to, Samson goes, wow, God did this great thing. He delivered me, and I killed 1,000 guys. So the natural thing is, well, God's now going to let me die of thirst. This is not rational, is it? But Samson was living in the moment. That's all he does. Now, let me tie this into something else here. Just a little history perspective. Israel. Where does the name Israel come from? Why is the nation called Israel? Do you remember the story? If we go back to Genesis, Isaac has a couple of sons, Jacob and Esau. And the whole 9 yards, the whole story of Jacob and Esau, they kind of turn on one there. Jacob tricks Esau, gets the birthright, all this type of stuff. But Jacob will end up having an encounter with God as he's returning home. And there's this whole sequence where Jacob has kind of a vision/dream, an encounter at night, and he wrestles, the Bible says, with God. He contends with God. And at that point in time, God renames Jacob Israel. Now, Jacob will kind of go by both names from that movie. He'll go by Israel, he'll go by Jacob. But God gives Jacob the name Israel because he contended with God. And if one of the things you could say about Israel as a people, they whine and complain, contend with God almost their entire history, don't they? And we see this even in Samson. You see this relationship between Israel and God personified in Samson. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. There was nothing. Israel never cries out for deliverer. They have given up on God. They have moved on, so to speak. And yet, because God had made a promise to Abraham, he's going to keep his covenant. He's going to deliver the people of Israel, whether they want to be delivered or not. Because he chose them, he's got covenant to keep. And even with Samson, we go back to chapter 13 and the whole nativity story around Samson. God made a covenant, he made a vow personified in Samson to have Samson, before he's even born, to be set aside to be a deliverer. That's why Samson is supposed to keep this Nazirite vow that we've already seen at least a couple times. He's already disregarded on his own. He knows exactly what he's doing. Samson knows who he is. He just sometimes doesn't care. And like Jacob and Esau, lives in the moment, just does what he wants to do, even if that means complaining to God and contending with God. He's living in the moment. Samson is never stepping back and looking at the bigger picture of what God is doing. He's always just living in the moment. Do we ever just live in the moment? Do we ever find ourselves so caught up in the emotions or the intensity of what's happening in front of us that we question God, get angry with God, doubt God, just get frustrated with God? Does that ever happen, or is that just me? Yeah, put your we do this, don't we? We can let the emotions get the best of us. We can let the moment get the best of us. Sometimes we can let years, say like 2020, get the best of us. And I'm not saying there's not real issues. I'm not saying there's not real frustration and real hurt and real pain. But we have to make sure we don't so live in the moment that we lose sight of what God is doing. God is actually, as we saw here in chapter 13, when he came to Samson's parents, he says, this one Samson will be the one I begin to deliver my people through. So even what he's doing in Samson here won't be completed in Samson. It's just going to be started in Samson. Now, for most of us, the 70, 80, 90 years, whatever it is we're going to have on this earth, to us, that seems like a long time, and we can't really think past that. But God's perspective is different. God is doing things generationally and through the centuries. I mean, we are still at this point in time 1,000 years away or more from Christ, and yet we're seeing hints of what Jesus will do and what he will be like. We're seeing hints of what God plans to do 1,000 years later by keeping his promises through men like Samson here in the book of Judges. So God provides. Samson has something to drink. And in verse 20 it says, he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Every other time we have seen, we've seen the exploits of Gideon or Jephthah or whoever it is, Ehud, it says, it describes to us whatever victory that they had. It says they judged Israel for so-and-so years, and generally that's the end of their particular story, isn't it? However, for Samson, it will not be the end of the story. What it really tells us is that even while Samson is doing all this, while he's in the process of delivering the people of Israel, Israel is still in captivity. There's still the delivery has not been completed yet. It's in the process, and there's going to be more to the story. So a couple things. One, Samson's living in the moment. We need to make sure we don't do that. We also don't want to be Israel in the sense that like the men of Judah, they have gotten so comfortable in their oppression. They've gotten so comfortable with even the consequences of their sin. They don't have any desire. They're not even asking to be delivered. And when given a deliverer right in their midst, when presented deliverance on a silver platter, they choose to turn on their deliverer and ally with the enemy of God's people. We saw this even with Jephthah. We saw this a few weeks ago when Jephthah, the judge that we kind of talked about the most before Samson, he defeats the Ammonites. On his way back home, the tribe of Ephraim confronts him and tries to pick a fight, and they end up fighting. Israel is so busy fighting one another that their attention is never focused upon the actual enemy. One more little nugget here before we're done. One more, maybe a lesson for the church. And I don't say this because there's fights in this. I haven't seen fights in this church, but what I'm saying is, we as the people of God have to be careful that we don't spend more time fighting one another and not fighting the actual enemy. Who is our enemy, by the way? Yeah. Paul says our enemy is not flesh and blood. It's not each other. Our enemy is the principalities, the powers of there. It's the evil one. Our enemy is a spiritual. We're in a spiritual battle. So that means our enemy is not each other. It's not even someone who believes politically different than us. Our enemy is the evil one who would divide us and have us fight with one another and ignore him in the process. One reason the Philistines could do whatever they want to the Israelites is the Israelites are too busy fighting one another. Now, whether that's churches or whether that's believers, whether that's families, whatever the context is, that's just a lesson we need to draw from this. All right, so next week we'll begin chapter 16, the next section of the Samson story, and we'll enjoy our time there. So if you are watching with us online tonight, I thank you for joining us. We're going to do some praying here, but I appreciate you being with us. We'll see you next week. Hopefully we'll see you on Sunday morning. Y'all have a great evening.